It's going to have all of these public policy implications. I'm not saying this is a calamity by any stretch of the imagination because there's benefits from it too, but it's a new reality. The huge mistake that we can make is if we continue to invest money, make public infrastructure investments from schools to highways to water systems to anything based on the fact that we're going to need a whole lot more of it in the future. We're going to need less of everything in the future. And you better plan on that if you're running a business or a city or a school or anything else.
Welcome to The Clear Voice, brought to you by Clear Career Professionals. I'm your host, James Groom. With us in the studio is James Hopper, Vice President with Clear. James, welcome back to the James and James Show.
Well, thank you so much, Chief Groom. I appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning.
Well, it's very exciting to have you on. And as usual, you come up with some of the most interesting topics. I appreciate you locating this author for us to talk to.
Yes, sir. Well, I'm excited to have Bill King with us this morning, too.
I think some people will kind of get their eyes opened if they kind of examine the realities of this. So our guest today is Bill King. He's the author of Depopulation, Our New Demographics Reality. Bill, welcome to the show, and thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Bill, can you tell us a little bit about your life and what led you to become interested in the topic of the book?
Well, I was a businessman lawyer here in Houston for decades and sold a couple of companies and retired some time ago. And I've been doing research and writing blogs since then. And I'm currently over at the Baker Institute at Rice University. We're looking at all these public policy issues. I became very fascinated with COVID and what was going on there and trying to understand the sort of math behind that and epidemiology, which led me off to starting to think about demographics a little bit. And really, for the first time in my life, I realized that professional demographers have been talking for a couple of decades about the fact that population growth is about to end and human population is about to start declining. And once I sort of figured that out, then I started looking at the phenomenon and trying to understand it. It has very, very significant implications for the future of just about everything.
It's an amazing topic. Like you said, it touches everybody. I think it's going to take a lot of people by surprise, even though it didn't just happen overnight. Well, Bill, let's dive into your book if you're ready.
Sure.
Your first chapter sets the context with a major mindset shift, the end of assumed growth. Please guide us through the data that leads you to conclude that we can no longer assume growth in communities and in our school districts.
You know, I grew up in the 60s, and when I think I was a senior in high school, I read Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Boom, and it was, predicting this catastrophic end of civilization because too many people were going to be born. And if you remember movies like Soylent Green and that sort of stuff, we had to eat people after they died. And so that's been the reality, the public reality for decades and decades. I can't imagine how many books have been written about it and, dire predictions. And none of that came to pass. But it didn't come to pass because the population wasn't growing very rapidly. It came to pass because we were able to, through technology, expand food production, medicine, and so forth to sort of compensate for it. But about the time the Ehrlichs wrote that book, which was in 1968, something very significant happened the first time in human history, and that is that women all across the world started having fewer children all of a sudden. Women historically have had 5 to 8 children during their lifetime, going back as far as we can sort of figure out records. And so in 1970, the worldwide rate was a little over 5. It was about 5.5. And all of a sudden it started dropping. Over the next 30 or 40 years, it dropped all the way down to just barely over 2. Well, you've got to have every woman have at least 2 children on average to maintain a population. You got to have a child replace a mom, a child replace the dad. And then because not everybody makes it to reproduction age, some kids die along the way, you've got to have a few extras. And so the general theory right now is a common number that you see is the average woman has to have about 2.1 children to maintain a stable population. Well, in 75% of the world today, lives in countries that are already below that replacement rate. Some of them dramatically below it, like Japan and China and some of those. United States is well below it and has been for some time now. And so once you fall below that replacement rate, the reduction in population is inevitable. It doesn't happen immediately because of the generational aspects of human reproduction. It is like a wave passing through the system. And so you don't see it immediately, but it inevitably comes. In the United States, we've had this other factor, which is immigration. But if it were not for immigration, there'd be essentially zero population growth in the United States today.
That's impacting. So we know also that we're living longer than we ever have. We're becoming older, but we're not becoming younger. Essentially have an aging population. What do you consider to be the most significant implications of this kind of an aging society?
Now, by the way, sort of surprising, we made tremendous strides in increasing life expectancy in sort of the second half of the 20th century, but that's kind of stalled at this point. Life expectancies have kind of stalled out at around the mid 80s or so. There seems to be a sort of natural limit there, at least that we haven't figured out to get past yet. In the United States, there's been essentially no improvement in the life expectancy, for the last decade or so. So we're sort of running up against that, but it really doesn't matter. There's some demographers have run some interesting models where they assume the life expectancy goes to 200 or 300. And it actually doesn't make much difference in the population because once you get past 20 or 30 years old, you're not having any children. And so it sort of delays the population decline, but it just delays it by a few years, and then you go right back to the same curve of going down. So people think a lot about people living longer, but for the demographic math, that's not all that impactful. What's impactful is how many children are being born.
I see. I see. Your book also touches on something that you mentioned, the global divide and the emergence of demographic divergence as opposed to uniform growth. Could you kind of explain a little bit of that to us, please?
The most severe case is in Southeast Asia, China and Japan, Korea, those places. This all started well back into the middle of the 20th century. China sort of supercharged it by adopting their one child policy. And so when you get to those kind of countries, you see the current birth rate's about one. And at that, you lose about half of your population of every generation going forward. So China has lost population for the last 4 years in a row. They had fewer births last year than any year they have on record, going all the way back to 1948. Japan is in much the same situation. Korea, really, and most of Europe is in this situation. The only place in the world where population is still growing is equatorial Africa. Those countries in the sort of the middle part of Africa still have pretty high birth rates. Not northern Africa, not southern Africa, but that middle part right around the equator there. And then a few countries in the Middle East still have high birth rates. But even there, it's only a handful. And so this is happening all over the world, but it's happening at different rates. So India, for example, is a great case study. Their birth rate just recently came down to the replacement rate. Because of this phenomenon of population momentum, India will keep growing for the next 30, 40, 50 years before they reach the peak and start declining, where China hit it 4 years ago. The United States, by the way, would have already hit it were it not for the fact that everybody in the world still wants to come here, or at least they did until recently. We've had this great advantage, which is we can control our population by how many people we let in if we could get our immigration policy straightened out, which we don't seem to be able to do.
That's one of the things I wanted to touch on at some point. Is that a viable mitigation strategy to maintain your workforce, your tax base, et cetera, in such a situation?
It is for some countries. There's not many countries in the world that are really set up institutionally or culturally to accept a lot of immigrants and then integrate them into their society. Really, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and some countries in Europe to a lesser degree. But America, about 60% of all the people that relocate in the world are coming to America. This is where everybody wants to be. And it is a strategy to mitigate it, but it's a temporary strategy because the countries that have typically provided us those immigrants, the birth rates are falling there. Latin America has been this great baby machine that's just, has produced all these young people to come here to work and everything. But every country in Latin America is now at or below the replacement rate. So their populations are going to be falling pretty soon, which means there's not going to be these masses of people to come to the United States from Latin America anymore.
Bill, you mentioned it, and I just curious without getting too political, and I don't watch the news, I'll confess. Is our federal government talking about immigration with depopulation in mind? Is that a source of conversation? Do you see any movement in making changes in that system?
So, we have not had a rational immigration policy for decades. And, both parties have failed in trying to get something done on the books that makes sense. Look, the rational thing to do would be to say we need about this many immigrants every year. These are the kind of workers we need. We're going to vet everybody before we let them in the country and make sure that they're not troublemakers, make sure they want to go to work, they can support themselves when they get here. That's the kind of rational immigration policy that most countries have, by the way. But we can't seem to straighten it out because we're too busy fighting with each other about all this stuff. So if we could get it figured out, it would be great. But right now, I don't see any movement towards a rational immigration policy. I will say this, the United States has had a long-standing love-hate relationship with immigration and immigrants, and it pretty much follows the percentage of the population that are recent immigrants. Once we get up to about a 15% ratio, then there's generally a reaction against immigrants. There's a backlash against, hey, we got too many immigrants. It doesn't feel like we're the United States. They're not assimilated. These are waves we've gone through multiple times in this country. Today, we're at about 18%. So I think that's why you're seeing the American public react like they are, which is, we think we have enough immigration right now. Not many people stop and think through what the economic implications of that are. They just see the disruption in their communities and they don't like it. So I think even if we could come to a rational immigration policy, I don't think the country's in the mood to accept a whole lot more immigrants.
No, I think you're exactly right, and we're seeing that. Is there anything else as far as implications or ramifications on the economy that you can see as with this declining population?
Sure. I mean, there are benefits and there's problems associated with it, but there are certainly going to be big disruptions. The basic economic formula for growth is the change in productivity plus the change in population. How many people are working and how productively are they working? That's how we determine what our gross national product is. If the change in population is going to go zero or negative, that means that all of the economic growth has to come from productivity increases. Fewer people are able to do more, produce more goods. And we've done a great job of that in the past, but we've also been buoyed up by this constant rising level of population. Things like AI, maybe we can, maybe that will end up generating enough increased productivity, but that creates its own disruptions. Robots, another thing that, is probably going to have an impact. It's definitely going to change. I'll give you just one idea about this for a second. Census Bureau has come out with some projections about what the U.S. population does at various immigration levels. Its base case is about 1 million people a year, which is sort of historically what we used to let in before this craziness over the last few years. And on that, they show the population increases for 2 or 3 more years here, and then it gradually starts declining, but it stays pretty steady. They then ran a scenario with 1.5 million, with 500,000. And then the one that really people need to look at it was zero immigration. And with zero immigration, the Census Bureau says that we will lose about a third of our population by the end of this century. That's about 100 million people. That's the population of California, Texas, and Florida all combined. We'll have that many fewer people in the United States at the end of the century if we have no immigration. But what are the implications of that? You go from a housing shortage to a housing glut. You don't need nearly as many cars built. You don't need nearly as many schools. You don't need nearly as many roads. You don't need nearly as many police officers. I mean, these are very dramatic changes that we'll have to grapple with. And that's why, we've got the luxury of postponing this for probably 100 years if we can get immigration right. If we can't get immigration right, we're going to look more like China and Japan. China, the UN says, will lose half of its population by the end of this century. Now, think about that for a second. We don't have any historical analog for a country losing that much population, especially not the second biggest country in the world. You're talking about a population decline of hundreds of millions of people. We have no idea how that looks like or how they're going to manage that.
You and I come from a similar era where the discussion was, oh my gosh, we're going to reach too many people on the globe, and then what are we going to do? We're going to run out of resources. And this is sort of the antithesis of that.
Right. And listen, when people were talking about, Malthus was talking about in 1800, when the Ehrlichs were talking about in the 1960s, that's certainly what it looked like was going to happen. Just nobody expected that all of a sudden women were going to decide we're going to have a lot fewer children. And it happened so incredibly fast. I mean, really about 20 or 30 years, the rate dropped from over 5 to barely above 2.
Bill, there's local leaders listening to this podcast, whether they be school district or city leaders. We're in North Texas, and certainly across Texas, there's a lot of growth, a lot of people moving in. I think sometimes you're narrowed into our own tunnel vision, into our own reality. I guess your premise is that if you're thinking that we're growing, we're just seeing a shift of population, and at some point in time, if things continue the way they are, that shift even ends, and a lot of what cities are doing, at least where they're growing or shifting in population, relies on more and more growth. That's the strategy. So what advice do you have to people that are relying on that growth, and what are you seeing in reality in places where they're shifting out of that population? What's going to happen?
All right. So first of all, there's only 3 sources of increasing population. One is having more babies and people dying. It's called natural growth. Having people, and when you're talking about it like a state or a city, having people move there from someplace else in the United States, that's called domestic migration, or people coming from another country, international migration. Those are the 3 factors that you've got to consider. We know natural growth is getting ready to go to 0. Domestic migration, surprisingly, has come down pretty dramatically in the last couple of 3 years. And there's a lot of discussion about why that may be the case, but people are not moving within the country nearly as much as they were a couple of decades ago. Part of that is the fact that we're getting older. And, if you think about it, most people that pack up and move across the country to some other state, it's mostly young people that do that. Once you've been around for a while in a place and you've got kids and grandkids and friends and a country club and all that kind of stuff, you're a lot less likely to pack up and say, okay, I'm going to move to Tennessee or whatever. And in Texas, we've had this great luxury of people coming here from all over the country for a long time, but that fell dramatically last year. Domestic migration into Texas fell by 2/3 last year. Now, we're about to get new census bureaus. And I say last year, that's actually as of the middle of 24. We're about to get numbers as of the middle of 25 here next week. So we'll have to see what that looks like going forward. But, the oil industry is not doing great these days. In Texas last year, 60% of our population growth came from international immigration. So if that goes to 0, or maybe it goes to negative numbers, which is what DHS is currently saying is the case, then, you could easily see Texas population decline this year or next year. And that would be something that we just haven't seen in, many, many decades. But all this means, for example, you look at the state sales tax revenues. They flattened out a couple of years ago, and they're not projecting much increase at all in sales tax revenue. Well, that's directly related to how many people. Toll road revenues are flattening out around the state. We've relied for so long in the public sector and the idea there's always going to be this growth. And so there's always going to be a bigger tax base. We can finance things off into the future. We were talking before the show about pensions. We can always put that off and deal with that later. Well, the bill's going to come due on a lot of this stuff. Now, the flip side, the good part of it is it takes the pressure off of having to build a lot of new stuff. James and I were talking about schools earlier. Look, the truth of the matter is, there will never be, unless we agree to take in a whole lot more immigrants, there will never be more school-age children in the United States, in the state of Texas, or in any region in Texas than we have right now. Every year from now on, there will be fewer school-age children in the state of Texas unless we open up the floodgates to international immigration, which I just don't think the country is in the mood to do. And so what does that mean? It means we don't need any new elementary schools, especially because that's to be the first place that you feel it. Now, you may need to go tear down elementary school and replace it or something like that, but we don't need any more increase in total capacity. We're doing a gigantic freeway project here in Houston right now, which is basically designed to try to catch us up to the current design demands. It was all these things were built back in the 60s and 70s, and we've obviously had tremendous population growth. But I talked to my friends about this in the highway building business. I said, look, you need to understand this will be the last big freeway project ever done in the city of Houston. We will never build another big freeway project after this one is finished because we're not going to need it. Transit is based on the idea that you have dense populations, a lot of people. That's going away. Transit population has been declining for a couple of decades now. So it's going to have all of these public policy implications. And the biggest mistake I think that we can make, and by the way, I'm not saying this is a calamity by any stretch of the imagination because there's benefits from it too, but it's a new reality. But the huge mistake that we can make is if we continue to invest money, make public infrastructure investments from schools to highways to water systems, anything based on the fact that we're going to need a whole lot more of it in the future. And by the way, on the private side, the same way. I've been, public companies have been having me come in and talk to them about this. We're going to need less of everything in the future. And you better plan on that if you're running a business or a city or a school or anything else.
Bill, it's a huge point to make. I saw this happen in real time. I was a school superintendent back in, about 2010. A new development came in, and we wanted to project growth for the future. And so we started counting number of students that we had per household, divide that, of course, by the number of houses, and we came up with about 1.8, okay? I did the same thing about 12 years later, and it was 0.5 number of students per household. So I saw that happen in real time. With that in mind, with fewer people, of course, there's going to be a shrinking tax base also for municipalities and for schools. Would it be advantageous then for schools and municipalities to strategize together and to try to mitigate the effects of this depopulation?
Well, I think the only thing they can do is right size their entities and governments and operations. If you think about this, the advantage of this is we've been chasing our tail to try to catch up with the growth. All of a sudden, we're not going to need to do that anymore. And it really gives us a little time and room to go back and sort of fix all the stuff that we maybe didn't do that good along the way, to get some of our infrastructure in really good shape as opposed to having to rush out and build a bunch more all the time. So this is, like I say, I don't think this is a big calamity, but I do think it requires an adjustment of what our focus is going to be. I'll give you another example. I have a good friend they build schools. They're a construction company and they specialize in building schools. And he said, well, what are you telling me? I said, what I'm telling you is you better start learning how to build geriatric hospitals instead of building schools. Because there'll be other opportunities that will open up that this creates. But at the same time, we could really waste a lot of money by continuing to make investments that there's not going to be able to use.
And you mentioned there's not a whole lot other than right sizing that cities can do. Every now and then I'll get a article across my feed that'll say like it's usually Italy or Ireland, and there's some other countries that the local cities in those countries are offering moving incentives to get, and it's usually you have to be a certain age, and they're trying to attract people that could have kids. I don't know that that's going on in the United States, even though there are, examples of cities in the past years, usually for economic reasons, as far as I can tell, like Detroit and like the Rust Belt, where there's cities that have seen this massive population move out. Do you foresee cities or governments doing anything to attract residents, basically competing for the dwindling population?
Yeah, I do. And by the way, there are about 50 or 60 countries that have adopted what are called pro-natalist policies, where they give incentives for people to have kids. It hadn't worked anyplace. Nobody's figured out how to, encourage people to do that, to really have a lot more kids. Locally, I think we've had this huge exodus out of the cities to the suburbs over the last decade. In 2024, 90% of the growth took place outside of cities with a population of 200,000 or more. Now, a lot of those were cities that were on the fringe of a big city. It was a suburban ring, and the exurban ring is kind of where the growth has been taking place. And you think, well, why are they going out there? Why are they leaving the city? Well, the value proposition of living out there is a lot better. Taxes are lower, there's not as much crime, they've got new infrastructure, roads are nice, they've got, walking paths and bike paths and all that kind of stuff. For a core city to try to compete with that, they're going to have to start figuring out how do we make the value proposition of living in the city as attractive as it is out there. I'll give you a stat that I use this pretty frequently for people that live in Houston, and nobody ever believes it. The population of Houston inside Loop 610, that's our close loop that's about 5 miles from downtown. The population inside that Loop 610 today is about the same as it was in 1960. So 60 years ago, that population is the same as it is today, which tells you all the growth has taken place in the outer rings.
Yeah, it's a shifting population for sure. You mentioned a little bit ago planning for, some pragmatic things like retirement homes or those kinds of things opposed to elementary schools. Do you see any other things on a practical side that cities and schools can do to again plan together to make sure that they're making the most of taxpayer dollars that are already spent?
Right. I think that, well, first of all, I think a lot of the core cities, I think they're going to be in real serious financial troubles going forward. I mean, Detroit was sort of a harbinger of what can take place. Detroit's population back in 1950 was almost 2 million people. Detroit in 1950 was almost as big as Houston is today. During that time between 1960 and today, they lost two-thirds of their population, went bankrupt, been a big mess up there. But interestingly, the Detroit SMA, the metropolitan area, actually grew during that period of time. And so the problem is these core cities, they got to get their act together and they've got to make it a value proposition to live in those cities. That means you get the garbage picked up on time. You have streets that don't have terrible potholes. You get your crime under control. Those are the sort of things that they need to be doing to compete, to get some of these people to move back into the city. But if you continue to make it a unattractive proposition, then it's going to continue to go the other direction.
Bill, do you know of any examples of cities that have been successfully reinvented themselves after having experienced a depleted population?
Well, not most cities have not really seen their population depleted in the United States. It's been a slowing of growth. But I think there's some cities that have done a better job. There's a lot of people that argue that, say, Charlotte, North Carolina, addressed some of these issues. Jacksonville, Florida, the same. I would say San Antonio is a pretty good case study and a city that's been able to kind of keep itself vitalized. Austin was for a while, but Austin's population is declining now. Now the area around Austin's growing, but it's so amazing to me that these core cities, they end up they make all the wrong decisions. They end up driving people out. They start trying to raise taxes. They get into financial trouble. They stop doing work on streets, and people just say, to hell with this. I'm going to go someplace else.
Bill, one of the questions I have, and this may not be a 5-year or 10-year issue, but one of the questions, like as I'm looking at these metropolitan areas, if we're talking about depopulation coming through and impacting these things where you're not going to see that growth, do you foresee maybe like, you can look at other countries, maybe like China, are there going to be like those decisions of combining services, like joint police departments, just because they're not able to no longer support a larger police department on their own? Are you going to see, school districts having to combine or fold? What's the worst case scenario that you see that people need to think about?
Well, I think there'll definitely be adjustments. I hate to call it a worst case scenario because I don't want to present this as being, uniformly negative, because there are some benefits to this. I mean, this takes a lot of pressure off the environment, for example. I don't want people to walk away wringing their hands about this. But sure, consolidation of entities, schools are going to be the biggest challenge. I mean, here, HISD at one time had, I don't know, 250,000 kids, James, something like that. They're down to 168,000 right now and dropping every year. we're going to have to start thinking about different kinds of models. When it comes to education, what does maybe getting more education at home as opposed to going to a school look like? But how's AI going to affect education? Education is going to be one of the most impacted by both the demographics and the technology. We've got this really interesting thing going on right now. We have this brand new demographic, which, by the way, human beings have been around for 300,000 years, and we've never seen this before. So this is a brand new experiment for, all of us, Homo sapiens. But at the same time, you got this explosion in technology happening at a faster and faster pace. And so how we navigate fewer people at almost, godlike technology is going to be really fascinating. I wish I was a little bit younger so I could just hang around and see how all this works out.
Interestingly enough, I just saw a clip this morning where Elon was saying that he thinks that robots actually will, if they don't already, outnumber human beings. So it's an interesting concept.
The thing about robots there's a lot of things they do very, very well. But for example, nobody's built a robot that knows how to make up a bed or.
We don't have kids that can do that either.
Yeah, exactly. And so I'm not sure. I think there's some limits on what we're going to be able to do with robots. I have a hard time seeing, nurses being replaced by robots. There's a certain human element to some of that. But for example, they've come up with a new little blood oximeter that they put on your finger and you're in the hospital to see what your blood oxygen is. They've come up with a new one that also constantly monitors your blood pressure, which means you don't have to have those orderlies walking around the hospital waking you up every 4 hours and taking your blood pressure. So there's that kind of technology that is not really robotic, but are going to still reduce the number of people that you need to do some of these jobs.
As a civic leader or a school leader, what indicators should I monitor most closely over the next in the coming years to make sure that my entity, whether it's a school or municipality, isn't adversely affected so much?
Well, I think that, you need to watch the demographic numbers very closely. And look, it's going to vary dramatically within the United States based on what we decide to do about immigration. Without immigration, we're going to go down very quickly. But if we could ever get that policy right, don't misunderstand me. I don't think either side's gotten it right. I don't think just letting people come across the border willy-nilly like Biden did made any sense, and I think it caused a lot of damage to the country. But at the same time, saying we're not going to let anybody come in is going to create a lot of problems also. And so if we could figure out how to not swing from one extreme to the other and have a rational policy, that would be a big deal. But I would be watching that very closely if I was in any kind of business or any kind of government entity, because it's going to so dramatically affect how many bodies you have to deal with, how many customers you have, how many students you're going to have, how many patients you're going to have in your hospitals. All this is going to be dramatically affected by those demographic numbers. That largely, almost exclusively, is going to turn on what we do about immigration going forward.
And it's not only those numbers, is it, Bill? It's also what their age is, their contribution to the workforce. All of those factors will come into play there as well.
There's an interesting ratio that demographers keep track of called the dependency ratio. It's something that got started a long time ago, but they take the percentage of the population that is 14 to 65 compared to the people that are below 14 and the people that are over 65. And that's called the dependency ratio. The idea is that those are all the people who are working and the ones under 14 are not working, people over 65 are not working. Now, over time, that's become less accurate because, we really don't go to work at 14 anymore. Everybody's going to high school and college, and a lot of people are working way past 65 today. So it's changed a lot. But that dependency ratio is something really to look at. And here's the interesting thing about it. The dependency ratio on the lower end, it turns out, as expensive as kids are, and everybody knows they're expensive, they're not nearly as expensive as taking care of old people because of the medical care that's associated with them. As that part of the dependency cohort grows, and that's put more and more pressure on Social Security, Medicare, all kinds of healthcare issues. At the same time, we're kind of taking pressure off the number of schools we need to build.
James, I don't know if you are familiar with the book Strong Towns. and it doesn't deal with depopulation specifically, but it is basically talks about how cities should grow without that growth mindset, and it has a lot of practical things. Maybe that's somebody we can work on next to have on to talk about how to strategize for cities and governments. Bill, I saw Elon Musk the other day talking about how in 10 years or 20 years, we won't have to work at all. It'll all be optional. You think that, robot technology is going to catch up that much? And I want to know, do you think that we're going to replace firefighters anytime soon with robots? And what about police officers? I love the public safety aspect.
I think Elon Musk does a really good job of building rockets and launching them. But I find a lot of his demographic information is pretty far-fetched. I don't think it's going to be a dramatic change. People think about all of a sudden, RoboCop comes out there. But, you could see where you could have a robot take a fire hose into a burning building with some kind of a sprinkler system that would blow out water or foam. I think you're going to see those kinds of innovations. Warfare. I mean, look what's happened in warfare just in the last 5 years with Ukraine. None of us thought about drones being a major offensive weapon. What role could drones play in law enforcement? I mean, increasingly they're being used, but still it's pretty early in the day on that. The diffusion of cameras, how many crimes do we see today that are solved by, somebody having a video camera, either stationary camera or somebody happens to have their phone out when the crime takes place. So I think there's going to be a lot of things that are going to make these jobs easier, but long short of RoboCop running around or RoboFire running around into buildings and that kind of stuff. I think it's going to be a more gradual move into technology that assists. Now, that means you will need less firefighters and less police officers, probably, but we're going to have less young people that that are going to go into those careers also, because just there's going to be fewer young people. So if we get this right, we actually could make the transition and make it very smoothly. One thing I worry about is people just not accepting the fact this is really happening. James had me out at Region 4, and I was talking to some young superintendents, and they were all clearly unaware. I mean, this was not on their radar screen that this was going on and might affect their school district.
One of the things about our schools, a lot of times when we come in there and a new superintendent comes in and you've got some new buildings, but you've also got buildings that some of them are built by the WPA pre-World War II. And so with that, of course, you have clay pipes and those kinds of things. Well, let's think about that in terms of cities as well. You mentioned the core of Houston or the core of Detroit. That infrastructure was laid over 100 years ago. So we've already got problems to be fixed just to maintain what we already have. And now we'll have that declining population or that declining tax base in which to do it. So that to me is a considerable issue for both schools and cities going forward.
It is for sure, but at the same time, you're not going to have the need to go out and grow capacity a lot. And so that takes some of the pressure off. Now, I'm not sure it takes off enough pressure to compensate for the conundrum that you're talking about, but at least we're not going to need to build another big freeway in Houston after this. That's a big deal because we spend a lot of money building freeways in Houston. That's going to be over here in a decade. And we're never going to need to build another one. And so we can take the funds that we're going into that and look at something else.
Well, that's a relief too, maybe on some of the traffic congestion, right?
No, absolutely. It makes a tremendous difference. Yeah. And it's also, the technology with autonomous driving and with smart grids. I'll tell you, the one industry that's going to get really hard is going to be transit. There won't be any transit a couple decades from now because it's not going to make any sense. It's too expensive to build and you're not going to need it. And that's one thing that we absolutely ought to stop doing. Fortunately, here in Houston, we had a gigantic $2 billion project. They were trying to go forward, and the current administration said, well, this doesn't make any sense. We don't have the riders to justify it. Those are the kind of decisions that people need to be making right now.
Bill, I really appreciate this. It's a stimulating conversation that we could go on and on with. But as we start to wrap up, are there any parting thoughts that you have or anything that we failed to ask that you wish that we would have?
I would encourage people to try to think about this moderately and not hysterically. And one of the problems I've got with some of the things that you see posted on X and in the media, like some of the stuff that Musk says, we're about to become extinct. Well, at a 1.5 birth rate, it takes 1,700 years for human beings to become extinct. A lot's going to happen over the next 1,700 years. Who knows? So I think we ought to focus on the near term, what's going to happen over the next several decades, and what policy decisions do we need to be making. For a lot of assets that you invest in, they've typically got a 30, 40, 50-year life. And so that's what we ought to be thinking about. We're building a freeway. What's the traffic going to be 50 years from now? If you're talking about building elementary schools, what's going to be the elementary school enrollment 50 years from now? And we can pretty accurately predict what that's going to be, at least in the aggregate. Now, obviously, there's some moving around between jurisdictions and everything that's always a little less certain. But we can make some pretty good guesses about it. One thing I think you and I were talking about that meeting was a bunch of school districts are now going out and doing 10-year demographic studies of their future enrollment. And that's something that was unheard of even 10 years ago. And they're finding out that, wow, it's not going to be nearly the increase I thought it was going to be, or it's going to be flatter. I might even be losing people.
As we look at this, and we're school districts and again, municipalities, as we sit down and do our strategic planning, we could actually do that together so that we could consolidate assets like buildings and all of those kinds of things that benefit the community. Once again, that we've already spent our money on. Let's consolidate those and see what we can do to better serve the public.
I think consolidating is going to be a big word you're going to hear a lot in the future. And I also think repurposing. If we don't need a school, how might we repurpose that? Could it be turned into a nursing home? Could it be, turned into homeless housing? What can we go use as opposed to just tearing things down? Is there some repurposing of these assets that we can come up with so we don't waste the money that was spent on them?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Well, gentlemen, I think it's been a great conversation. It sounds like there's some people out there talking about this, and maybe they need to tone down the rhetoric. And there's some people, or maybe a lot of people, that don't have this on their radar, and they should take a look at it. Bill, we'll definitely encourage people to get a copy of your book. I'm assuming that's available on Amazon and everywhere else you can buy a book.
It's available on Amazon for sure, and a paperback, and also on Kindle. So if you like to read on your computer.
I've got the Kindle version, but I guess I can't get you to sign that one. So I'll have to buy the actual hard copy and send it to you. Thank you for being on today. We appreciate the topic and learning about how it's going to impact us today and, of course, in the future. James, thanks for being with us and bringing us this amazing topic. And we want to thank everybody for listening. Please follow the podcast on your favorite platform. Be sure to check out Clear's website and LinkedIn for the latest career opportunities, and we will catch you next time.